So this is pretty much just mowed. There's no fertilizer, or there's no irrigation on it either.
Do people really need to fertilize their lawns? I mean, our lawns turn green no matter what, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think following a recommendation like a light fertilization in fall is pretty good for getting roots to recover and develop in spring.
I see.
That being said, we don't fertilize any of our own turf.
Yeah.
So I think if you're mowing high and you're generally keeping the grass competitive, it's pretty stress resilient and good to go. But
if you let your, lawn grass go high, I mean, you start to see flowers and things like that. Does the community change at all, or is it just are all the seats in the bus full, like kind of in the?
That's a good question.
Lawn?
I think it can change in that a lot of the plants that normally would be really damaged by regular mowing, have another competitive edge because they're allowed to get more biomass on them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But you're increasing flowering heads within the turf if you do that. We're looking at that in another experiment, trying to see how mowing frequency changes the plant community.
Huh.
So,
all right, so let me set the stage. We're going to be doing a little digging here because
just to see what we find.
We want to see what we find, and then we also want to talk about worms too.
Yeah.
Worms and soil, something that we always see, especially when we're like gardening and things along those lines. And what do worms even mean? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they neutral? So what are we about to see here? Like, what do we expect to see when we actually dig in the
soils
soil?
are fairly moist right now, so I'm guessing we'll see some earthworms, maybe some of the other smaller biota that we saw pickled in the lab actually moving here.
What was life like before? Because earthworms aren't even native here, right?
These ones are not, yeah.
Yeah, so
we do have a few native species of earthworms in New York.
But they're tiny, right?
They're tiny. They tend to be in wetlands, bog habitats, and more downstate.
So what was life like without earthworms before?
Great question. It's a really good question. Whether or not we had some other engineers in those soils to do something similar is not, I don't actually know. Maybe somebody does. But they certainly changed things once they were introduced to the area, once the glaciers retreated and sort of soil deposition happened.
I mean, with the glaciers retreating, my understanding is that a lot of our surface soil was scraped off anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and you can see, I think the Finger Lakes is a great place to see that,
yeah.
right? The deposition at the bottom of the lakes versus the top, very different soil types.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe it was a blessing that we have earthworms because they are bringing...
Well, like you were saying before, the pioneers of the soil, I think that is something that's a service they really do provide in soil. I think it's context dependent, them in a forest versus them in an area like a lawn or in an agricultural field, very different ecology and different function.
So talk to us about that, context dependent. Like what would it mean if you do see it in like your turf grass versus like a forest habitat?
Yeah, so maybe we start with forests. Forests really depend on a leaf litter layer. It's that buffering capacity it provides. Young plants, understory plants really depend on that to germinate. Like I just saw bloodroot recently. That's a really great one that likes leaf litter layer to protect the seedlings.
Sanguinaria canadensis.
Yeah, beautiful plant, right?
Yeah.
So earthworms, even the European species that we'll likely see in here today, they feed on that leaf litter layer. Some species will live within it. Some species will come from deep and permanent burrows, grab it and drag it back down. And when they're invasive in forests, they'll actually remove that leaf litter layer to some extent.
So even the European earthworm could remove that leaf litter, and if you're trying to promote, it can change basically the plant dynamics.
Totally, yeah. It can make it vulnerable to invasive species of plants coming in, make it the soil's a lot more compact, the aggregate. Even though they're there mining soil, it's just a little bit too much of a good thing for the soil.
So in parts of New York State, we also have the invasive jumping worm. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so they're earthworms, just like the European species, like night crawlers that we see here, but very different in their biology, their behavior. If you've ever seen them before, you know what I mean, but they get their name for a good reason.
I've seen videos and they look like little snakes and
they're
kind of
wild,
like jump out, but like I've never seen one in real life.
Yeah, so we've got, I think, 3 species of jumping. It's a kind of a group of species.
Oh wow, so there's 3 species.
Yeah, in New York. There's there's more than that of jumping worm in the US now, but we have roughly 3 here in this area. Ecologically, they're pretty similar in terms of what they do. And usually if you recognize it as a jumping worm, we don't go beyond that to say, well, what's the species before I do anything? They have the same effect. So, but very, very different. Like the European worms, they have permanent deep burrows. They'll live deep. We call them anesic worms. They'll come up, they'll grab stuff like grass clippings, twigs, leaves, and they'll drag it down into burrows.
I'm taking this.
So it's like, you
see a big stick
going through the drive-through, and sometimes in the morning you'll see little twigs standing up in a cluster of soil, probably an earthworm that grabbed it and tried to cram it down into the hole.
That's so funny. I'm going to be looking now.
You'll find them, yeah.
I mean, sometimes I go into the soil and I see earthworms that are like massive,
Oh,
and I'm
yeah.
like, oh, is that a pregnant female or something? I mean, just so fat, you
Yeah.
know, it's kind of grotesque.
The lumbricids can get really big. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. They're pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So jumping worms are different in that they don't have that vertical permanent burrow. They live right at the soil surface. We call them epigeic worms. And they're right within the top few inches, living at the leaf litter interface, and they're consuming and mixing all of that material right there, which can be a good thing for soils, mixing organic matter with the mineral matrix. But they do it so much and so aggressively, they provide way too much mineral nutrient all at once. It's like putting all of your food in front of you at once, right? You're never going to efficiently use it. And
Right,
that's
it's
kind
like
of
a
what jumping
buffet.
worms are doing.
I see. And then also talk about red wiggler worms, because those are the ones that typically people will vermicompost
Yeah.
with, and sometimes those earthworms and like those red wigglers are sometimes conflated. Like they're kind of confused, but they're separate.
They're different
also.
species of earthworm,
Yeah.
different genera of earthworm. So, and they're really dependent on high organic matter content. You really don't see that unless they've kind of come out, and moved a little bit from a compost bin. You really don't see those out in soils like this.
Right,
So,
and I think that was actually a misconception, because I can't remember. There was a few comments on one of the videos that I had, and they're like, that earthworm, that you should be throwing food scraps on top of it or something. And it's like,
Yeah, yeah.
That's quite different than
Different.
from like
Yeah.
our typical like composting worm that you would
Yeah, yeah.
have in your compost bin. And like you said, that composting worm doesn't really travel much outside. It's there where the food source is, essentially.
Yeah, and they can escape from there. Actually, that's one of the biggest problems with earthworm invasion is people dumping them in places and moving from there. The Canadian nightcrawler is used in fishing a lot regularly.
Yeah.
And the typical practice is just dump the can when you're done. And so there's a lot of data showing kind of spread from popular fishing areas.
Fascinating.
So, but yeah, very different earthworms.
Yeah.
They do rely on the same thing, the organic matter, but the red earthworm,
Wigglers,
red
yeah,
wigglers, you
wigglers,
tend to find them a lot more around really rich organic matter
Also,
sources.
I think you have to protect them to a certain degree. Like, I don't know if they overwinter as well, and like,
Right, yeah.
if you're using them indoors, you can't let them dry out at all.
Yep.
Obviously, there's like all
Yeah, you're
sorts
kind
of
of
things.
cultivating them along.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, these earthworms, because they're such deep burrowers, they'll actually, like a lot of things in soil, they'll move below the frost line, they'll ball up
Really
to preserve
below
moisture.
the frost line.
Yeah.
So like that's
Our insects do
4
that
feet
too,
down
like white
below.
grubs.
Wow.
Well, most white grubs will go down about a foot and they'll
Okay.
stay there and they'll get just below that point where things are freezing really hard and
Yeah.
they'll survive the winter. No feeding or anything like that. Their metabolic
In
rate
a
really
stasis.
slows down.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but jumping worms, really shallow. They just mix and mine that surface soil. They'll aerate the soil so much that roots just can't survive. They'll fall over,
That's
basically.
the issue. That's the issue with the jumping worms. They were saying, I remember, because even on slopes and forests, if they're only at the soil surface,
Yeah.
they're messing up the roots so much that some of these plants are just coming
They'll
out.
fall right down out of the ground. Yeah.
Okay.
So aerification of soil's good. Mineralizing nitrogen's good, but that much is just not good.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why in a forest setting, and kind of with jumping worms in horticultural settings, garden settings, you get those bad responses. Shifting back a little bit to the European worms, in a setting like this or an agricultural soil, they're great because they help mineralize nitrogen. That's like, sort of like biofertilization for the soil. They help form aggregates in soil, increase its stability, because otherwise you're plowing it. So they can have a lot of benefits in those soils. So it's really that context that you got to think about.
Yeah, the
with earthworm.
mineralization of the nitrogen is really interesting. So is it very similar to like if you planted a legume?
Similar in that it's taking an organic source of nitrogen and turning it into a mineral nutrient that a plant could take up. So I think with the plants, it's taking a mineral form, fixing it into biotic, but it's sort of the other way around, where they're taking molecules like proteins and chitin in the soil, and they're breaking that down into something that's mineral and available to plants, like ammonium or nitrate. So that's kind of the process. And they're doing that in conjunction with microbes too. So yeah.
All right.
Dig some holes?
Let's dig some holes.
See if the grounds folks yell at me for popping holes.
I
in them.
know, exactly. They'll be like, we have a groundhog.
And he runs the turf program.
Yeah. Oh, that's nice.
I chopped a grub up, but we can talk about that one if I can find most of it. All right.
Oh, man.
Yep, it's
Half
a grub
a
without a
grub.
butt, and the butt is what you need to identify it, so you can't. Sorry, folks.
Gonna find his arse.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's more in here.
Yeah.
That's probably a Japanese beetle larva. So really important root feeder. So they love to sit down at the tip of these roots and just graze away on the roots.
I found the worm.
Yep. We didn't chop that one in half.
No. But if you chop them in half, do they still live?
So
wonder.
they can regenerate.
Yeah.
it depends on the species, how much they can regenerate, like how much damage they can survive.
Yeah.
But they can regenerate.
It's got to still hurt, you know?
There have been studies where people have cut them to different segments and said, well, how well did they regenerate after that? So,
oh, torturous.
yeah.
So can you tell what kind of earthworm this is? Or?
This is probably a juvenile lumbricid earthworm.
There's another one.
Yeah, so it's not mature, so there's
Yeah.
something you'll see on there called a clitellum, which is sort of that little
That
swollen
swollen
saddle-looking thing.
Yeah.
That's where a lot of the reproductive junk is on the earthworm. And they don't develop that till they're
Here's some
much older than
of
that.
the ants as well.
Yep. So what the group of macrofauna that we call ecosystem engineers, ants are in the same group. So, where earthworms are burrowing and making lots of engineered spots in the soil, ants are making more of a confined nest with foraging tunnels. So,
Yeah.
but they're still engineering that soil profile, dragging organic matter, making middens. So similar in that way.
Yeah, when I see ants, sometimes they're up under a rock and it's like still very dry. This is actually, they're fairly deep in the soil, I would say.
Yeah, some nests can actually go real deep. One of the most well-known ant biologists did some castor plast molds of ant nests and just like poured the stuff into the soil and then excavated them out. And these things are just gorgeous. They're
Wow.
amazing. There's these tunnels going down, these elaborate middens and nest pockets going off to the sides. And every species has a different structure to the nests that they
Yeah.
make. So
Fascinating.
just exploiting the soil for that.
I mean, this looks
matrix.
like pretty good soil,
Yeah.
I would say here.
Yeah, and again, it's not something that we're disturbing physically. And
Yeah.
if you think about agriculture and the push for cover cropping, they're trying to recreate basically what you get in a grass system like this. Continuous plant cover, which is one of the biggest drivers of earthworm distribution, vegetative cover, and continuous moisture.
I mean,
So-
grass is not necessarily a bad thing. Like there is a lot of war on lawn, but grasses do serve a purpose. But the
Yeah.
question is it the fact that it was Eurasiatic lawn?
Yeah.
Is it like what is people's big beef about lawn?
Yeah, some of it is legit, some of it I think is assumption. One of the big assumptions we have is that all lawns are fertilized and irrigated, and it's actually a very low percentage that are.
I was going to say, I mean,
A lot of them
maybe
look like the typical upstate mow it and forget it
Yeah,
kind of.
I mean, I remember going into Long Island and doing some lobbying because there were a lot of people who did fertilizing and everything. I think the landscapers just did that. They
Yeah.
fertilize and they mow and they all do
Their
that
calendar
kind of
practice,
stuff.
yeah.
But like I said, I've never once fertilized my lawn. It gets green, as soon as March or April comes around, and it stays green for quite some time. And even if
Yeah.
it goes brown, maybe because there's a drought, I'm not going to overwater it or do it.
Yeah.
It still survives, to the next year. So some of it might be overhyped. It just depends on where you are regionally and what cultural practices
and that's
you're
an
doing.
important one. Yeah,
And
location.
then and of course, if you're in like Salt Lake City and you have a lawn, it's
Yeah,
bad to you.
there
Or
are places where they
Arizona.
make more sense than others.
Yeah,
for sure.
precisely.
So some of these older lawns, it's common, especially up in this area, to have an acre or two of lawn, and where you mow it. One of the trade-offs you have with that is the mowing itself. So 2 and 4 cycle engines like
Yeah.
that, they emit a lot of greenhouse gases.
Right.
So trying to
Yeah.
find a way, raising the blade, mowing less frequently, you can really cut those emissions. The fact that the root systems can be so dense in grasses really gives them a good capacity for sequestering carbon, but you have that balance of bringing carbon into the system through roots
Yeah.
and what you lose when you maintain it. So
Yeah,
finding the right
that's true.
balance to actually get more storage and locking up of carbon than
Right.
losses is the key.
And I mean, part of the other thing about grasses too is a lot of grasses, their roots can go down fairly deep.
Yeah.
I would say in some cases like deeper than even some trees, for instance.
Yeah.
Some trees, tend to go outwards in the first 6 to 8 inches of soil, and sometimes you see. I have this great root book. I don't know if you've ever seen
yeah.
it. I think it was a
The old
scientist back
sketches?
back in the 1920s or
amazing?
whatever, where he just took these massive transects,
Yeah.
and you see this grass root going all the
Think
way
about the
down.
work to dig some of those things out,
Oh,
right?
I can't even imagine. Then draw them all and stuff
I
like
know.
that. It's crazy.
Where was that book from? I saw some illustrations recently, and they're all like pencil sketches
Yes.
of like grassland
Yeah,
plants.
I can't remember. I have the book. I just don't remember the name of it. There's 2 books that I got actually that really show the roots.
Yeah.
And one was like kind of tried to mimic what that original scientist had done.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know anybody who has the patience
Oh
for
yeah,
that.
I know. It's like, no,
Maybe
the root hair
Hayden
goes
does
this
with
way.
like counting the leg hairs on a mite,
But
So-
you know, even grasses like this can get really dense and thick root biomass.
Yeah.
And all these are little
It's great
conduits for
soil.
carbon entering the soil.
I mean, look at, this is great. Like these little aggregates, it's not too wet, it's
Yep,
not too
it's
dry.
well aggregated.
Yeah.
You see large and small aggregates. And aggregates is one thing that we know earthworms really increase. So
Yeah.
we did a study where we excluded earthworms from the turf root zone, and we looked at aggregate responses in that. Another graduate student of mine, Natalie Bray. And we found that when earthworms are present in that system, you get more aggregates, and more of the recently fixed carbon from photosynthesis ends up locked up in those aggregates. So you
I
can
see.
physically see how the biota are contributing to packaging and storing that
Yeah.
carbon in soil. You know?
So when I say save the worms, now you know why I do it.
Got a
Yeah.
reason.
Except those jumping worms. Like,
Yeah, right. You got to be able to separate them for sure.
yeah.
There's the
There's
surface
there's
of the
ant
nest.
habitat right
Yeah,
there.
you see the larvae in there. I feel bad when I rip one of those puppies open.
I know, and he's like, oh, my eggs, my eggs. Gotta save the eggs.
Let me see if I can find another whole-bodied white grub so we can talk about that a little bit. Another earthworm, a little larger one.
Oh, there's another worm. Oh, look at that worm.
Yeah.
Hello.
So these are all juveniles. So the European earthworms, they survive the winter as juveniles and adults. And again, they'll just sort of moderate their position in the soil profile, get really inactive, whereas jumping worms, they survive as eggs. The adults just die. When soils get below 40 degrees in fall, you got an earthworm head there. Yeah.
He's still moving though.
Yeah.
It's so crazy.
So yeah, they'll survive winter. The jumping worms, it's just the eggs that do.
Yeah.
So if you're seeing large worms in spring, you're not seeing jumping worms. There's possibility they could survive in really warm soils all winter,
Oh, I see.
like greenhouse container, but for the most part.
So jumping worms are more in the summer, you mean?
So
Or-
right now, they're all the eggs are hatching. So they're small enough that you're not
I
going to
see.
find
So
them
you'll
in soil.
never see one now because they're
Right.
all hatching. Okay.
Yeah. So once we get around July, they start to get larger and you start to notice them. And it's almost like the number of earthworms seems like it doubled in your soil if they're there.
Huh.
So that's one misconception because people get, they're really pumped about gardening in spring.
Yeah.
They're out, they're starting to see earthworms. They read this thing on jumping worms and they're
Yeah.
like, I freaking out
I
about
garden
it.
all year round, and in the last 2 years here, and I have not seen them on our
Okay,
land.
that's
So I
good.
think I would have noticed them because I purposely went online and said, okay, how do they move?
Yeah.
And ours are all slow. They're all
Gotcha.
like slow, they're earthworm slow,
Yeah. Yeah, you'll know it when you see it.
Yeah.
Their bodies are not quite as soft. They almost feel a little more rigid. And they are spastic when you handle
Yeah.
them. It's the sciencey word for it. I'm not seeing more white grubs. Surprising that we're not. So right now, all the white grubs have come back up from their winter habitat deeper in the soil. They're coming up, they're gonna feed for about a month, turn into pupae, and then emerge as adults. But this is a really active time for them to feed. So a lot of people think, treat my lawn now, but grass is really good at recovering from feeding from grubs right now.
Yeah.
So, we don't really
So how many
recommend it.
earthworms is good? Like how many worms in a soil, especially in like this turf grass, like is good? Like, do you want to see like, a
question.
certain number?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's a density that you're trying to look for.
Yeah.
We can get pretty high densities. In this type of volume, you can have dozens of individual adult earthworms. But how that translates to and that's where it gets tricky. We could talk to a farmer about a pest threshold. Like you're gonna get economic damage and you should pull the trigger on an insecticide spray when you see this number, for example. When it comes to densities of fauna, being as prescriptive is harder to do. So like this many nematodes or earthworms will give you this much nitrogen mineralized for a plant.
Right, okay.
So, but again, sort of that idea of tracking densities and seeing are they improving or staying the same versus decreasing, I think is a good recommendation in general.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you for giving us like the one-on-one on worms.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, you got
this is very useful, and I think it's going to be really helpful for people not to confuse the different worms, and maybe we can't get it down to species or whatever, but
There's an egg.
oh, of something, right?
Yeah, it's an earthworm egg.
Oh, really? That's a little earthworm egg?
Yep.
Oh.
So they call them a cocoon, and basically when the earthworm, most of them are hermaphroditic, so
Yeah.
they have male and female parts. They'll trade sperm with one another to fertilize their own eggs, and then they'll produce an egg as sort of like a foam blob around their body that they'll slip off of it, they'll make a cocoon around it, and you get an individual egg that develops in the soil.
There's also a lot of pathogens that use the earthworm to get to another
To
host.
move around, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that mucus layer or in the gut is a really good...
It's a common issue if you have chickens, and you have chickens that
interesting.
eat earthworms.
Yeah.
There's a lot of diseases that transfer from
I
earthworm to
didn't know
chicken.
that. Yeah, so I know a lot of people will feed earthworms to their chickens. They'll feed white grubs to their chickens.
You cannot stop an chicken from eating an earthworm.
Yeah.
When they see it, they'll just gulp it down.
That's
you
like
know?
the jumping worm. They're like, I'll just feed them to my chickens if I have jumping worms.
Oh, man.
So
Yeah, there's a lot of diseases that come out of like the earthworm, unfortunately. But you know, there's nothing you could do to prevent if you're free ranging your chickens.
yeah, right. They're gonna find them.
Yeah.
There's a live one.
Oh yeah, there we go.
So that's a Japanese beetle larva. The way you identify these things is you have to actually look at the hairs on their butt. So right down there
Yummy.
with the hand lens. So we built a key online. It's like the
Okay.
coolest website ever to identify
How
what
many
these
butt
are.
hairs does this
Yeah.
grub have?
But it's an important decision-making tool because
Yeah.
a lot of people will see it and they'll think, I need to treat this area.
Right.
But there's different thresholds for the species. You might not have enough that's ever going to do anything.
Right, and are these all predatory? Are all the ones that look like white grubs predatory to a certain degree?
These are all herbivorous. They're all going to feed on grasses,
I
but
see.
the extent to which they're going to do it differs by the species
Yeah.
for sure.
I mean, I just feel like you have a lot of grass. Like,
Yeah.
it's okay,
We
right?
find them here every time we dig,
Yeah.
but we've very rarely seen any damage that we need to do. So
Yeah.
to take any management against. But I mean, there are areas where they will get above that threshold and damage it.
Okay,
and it's
and then
very
you'd have like
noticeable.
dead spots or something.
Yeah, it looks kind of like drought that doesn't recover once
I
it gets
see.
some water.
Okay.
So,
Got it.
but turf can, if it's a healthy turf and you're maintaining a lot of above ground biomass on it to keep it resilient,
Yeah.
it can handle a lot of feeding.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Do you know what kind of species of lawn this is? I mean, I see clovers in here too. But
Yeah, the grasses around here tend to be sort of a blend of Kentucky bluegrass. There's a lot of tall fescue in this as well,
Okay.
and some ryegrass.
Okay.
So there's some annual bluegrass in here that also kind of came in on its own.
Mm-hmm.
So, but typically the older lawns tend to be as much Kentucky bluegrass as possible because it's that nice emerald green. But there's this push to get more and more fescues, tall fescues into lawn, just because it's a lot more drought tolerant. Doesn't need to be watered as much. So.
Nice.
Yeah, but again, this is not watered. We still get that cool season grass die down and dormancy that you see in summer
Yeah.
here, and then they come back in the fall.
Yeah, that was really interesting. That was one of the other strategies that we did. Is I think that we had 2 cool season and 1 warm season
Yeah,
grass.
so you can try to get a continuous green.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's smart.
Yeah. And it's just, hey, I think more studies need to be done on it because we'll have no idea what the different underground communities or above ground communities look like unless somebody does the techniques and then studies it afterwards.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think too, when you're getting higher diversity, even if it's genotypic diversity in a grass stand, you're getting a better ability to host biodiversity. You know, plant diversity begets soil diversity.
Yeah.
So how that plays out in a lawn, we don't quite know yet. But
Yeah. Who knows?
we have a lot more flexibility with the cool season grasses because you can seed them easier. Like in Florida, where they have warm season, it's from plugs or
Yeah.
sod.
Well, the warm
So-
season, that's what I didn't realize is that part of the reason why it was so slow is that we needed like at least 3 or 4 days of 85-degree temperature for that warm season to germinate.
Yeah.
Which is why some of the spots took a long time germinating.
Yeah, yeah.
And then once summer hit, it started to come up and we're like, oh.
There it is.
And then I think I really overseeded. I was very generous with the seed because the grass is like really full.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, overseeding is actually a really good practice. You know, if you want to do something that's low input, but you want to try to maintain as dense of a lawn as you can, repetitive overseeding throughout the season is a great way to keep that grass.
We seeded
competitive.
twice actually, once
Great.
in spring and once in summer.
Okay, yeah.
Because we were informed that with the warm season grass, even though you're seeding it in fall, it may not take. And then so we were kind of reseeded again at the end of spring, early summer, where we did one in fall and one in spring application. I think that was kind of a repeated application on top of another one, just to make sure some of that warm season would come up.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a practice that is used a lot on school grounds because with the Child Safe Playing Field Act in New York, schools can't use pesticides without some kind of exemption from the school board.
I see.
So overseeding is a really great way to keep that turf stand competitive, so you keep it there. So
Especially
that's one
with
of the tools.
children playing on it all the time too. I mean, that could
Trafficking,
people
yeah.
people want lawns for their pets to go on and their kids to play in. But firsthand, especially because I was in the city for quite some time, and there was a beautiful lawn leading up to one of our parks, like on the street that I lived on. And as soon as more people started to move in, they started to bring their dogs in the area, and it's a dust field. It's so sad because it was such a wonderful lawn to sit out and look at the East River.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it became a dog park, and it was just like dust everywhere, and you can't maintain a lawn.
Yeah.
Not with that amount of dogs on it.
Yeah. We've done some work down at Greenwood Cemetery looking at soil communities in different areas of the cemetery. And there we've been actually looking at acoustics to see if you can use sound to detect differences in soil animal communities. So the cemetery is a nice quiet place, but you can get very loud edges. So we've been looking at that throughout. Greenwood is just gorgeous. So.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This is very elucidating and it allows folks to understand really what's happening underneath their ground. Thanks so much for taking up some of the sod. This beautiful sod here.
Yeah, you got it. That's all right. I won't even know it was here in a week. Stuff usually repairs pretty quick, so.
Stay tuned here because we'll have more stories from the underground world here on Flock. If you enjoy these educational videos, then do us a favor and give them a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the notifications button so you know when new videos release. We work hard to bring you solid content to help you become better stewards of the environment and would greatly appreciate the love in return. 10% of our Google AdSense proceeds are reinvested back into community projects here in the Finger Lakes, and that's matched by our partners over at Espoma Organic, which is a fourth-generation, family-owned and operated business that has been on the forefront of organic gardening since 1929. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next video.
Tell us what this is.
Yeah, so it doesn't look super cool from the side, but this is actually just kitchen mustard, so mustard powder you'd use to cook. So it's about a third to a half a cup of mustard powder mixed in with water, just tap water.
Like a gallon? Or in a gallon
of water.
Okay.
Yep, and you would just irrigate it into 1 to 2 square foot area of soil. And that material will irritate the surface of the earthworm. So jumping worms, European worms.
Okay.
Some of the deeper worms will just go deeper rather than coming out of the ground. But this is a good way to monitor soils to see, especially if you have jumping worms.
Okay.
So it's not like something you use to control worms. There's really nothing out there labeled
You're
to
just
control
seeing
them.
if you have them.
Yeah, it's a test to monitor. You wouldn't know if you had eggs or anything like that, but you
Right.
could see if you had the live
And then you would
worms.
do it in the late spring, summer months, because you said in the spring that the eggs are just hatching. So
Yeah, so if you're looking for jumping worms and you tried it in spring, you really wouldn't see anything. But
Okay.
it would be a real good way late summer to see if you had jumping worms in the system.
Got it.
If you're not already seeing them under mulch beds and things like that.
Right,
So,
right, precisely.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, thanks for that.